Start the meeting. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a special committee of the whole meeting for September the 11th, 2023. First, starting off, I'd like to acknowledge that I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands of Acadia First Nation, part of Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Please note that I believe Deputy Warden Trevor Cunningham is absent with regrets. He's certainly going to try to get here as soon as possible. He has a medical appointment, and Councillor Lauren Cushion is not here yet. I do see Councillor Patty Durkee just come online. A little bit of ground rules. People that are watching, or what we would call attendees, this is not for the attendees to ask questions. However, the panelists can ask questions, and I'd like to advise the panelists that if you use the chat function, that any of those questions will be posted on when it's posted on YouTube, so everyone can see the questions that you may post in the chat section. And also to remind everyone that this is an information session only. Council will not be requesting any changes. This is just for information for everybody. The next time that council will be reviewing this document would be on this, September the 27th, 2023, regular council meeting at 6 p.m. So we have one agenda item, briefing from Upland. Is there any additions or deletions to the agenda? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda as circulated. Moved by Councillor Sherry Hurlbert and seconded by Councillor Daniel Allen. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Motion carried unanimously. I'd like to remind everyone, if you have a question or a comment, please try to use the your raise hand function. If not, I may or may not see you, or if you don't know where it is, just hold your hand up like that until I acknowledge that I see your hand, and you can put it down, and I'll try to put you where I've seen you, provided there's no other raised functions or raised hand functions on the on my screen. All right. Item 4, briefing from Upland. We have with us Ian today, and I do believe Fukiyashi is with us, and also Derek Robertson from staff. So item 4.1, the draft municipal planning strategy. So I'm going to turn this over to one of the staff members who would like to get started first.
Thank you, Warden. I guess I can take it away if that works for everyone.
Yep, that works.
All right. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Watson. For those in the attendees who haven't met me yet, senior planner with Upland, and we're helping the municipality through the plan review process. Yes, thanks for all taking the time this afternoon. I think this will be useful to gear us up for the formal approvals process. My intention today is to kind of go through a high level overview of all the different, well, how we got to where we are today, I guess, and all the various aspects of the draft documents. Some council members are on PAC and have been with us all along, you know, and have an intimate knowledge of how we got to where we are and what's in the documents, but not all council members are. And ultimately, council is going to be the body who adopts the document and, you know, takes ownership over it. So this is a really great opportunity as a committee of the whole to for those council members to get familiarity with documents and understanding what it is that they're potentially adopting. As the warden mentioned, this is, I guess, a discussion workshop today. You know, for me to introduce the documents, I'll do a big info dump for you to ask questions as a committee, but we're not in a position to make any decisions today or any changes to the documents. So what I would suggest is, is to take note as we're going through if there's things that pique your interest or you know, don't sound like something you could support. Take note of that, and we can flag those as something that we can be prepared to discuss at the formal council meeting, you know, as potential changes or things to discuss further. So I will share my screen. Everybody can see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. I guess I'll get right into it if that makes sense. So I guess before I get started, I guess we've been working on this coming on 2 years now. As you know, the municipality has existing planning documents, a municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw. But good plans are not set in stone. They evolve with the time and with changing contexts. And, there's things we didn't know about years ago when we were doing original plans. The context has changed. So just like a business plan or whatever, you want to come back to it every so often and update it. So this project is really about updating the municipality's planning documents. One other piece of context is that in Nova Scotia, we have now, for the first time, minimum planning standards regulations. So prior to 2018, planning was optional in Nova Scotia. It is no longer optional. All areas of all municipalities must be planned. The municipality of the District of Yarmouth already met this standard. All areas were planned, but there was also now requirements, specifics about what needs to be a plan. And again, the municipality met most of these. There were some small things about engagement and everything. But it is important, that this expectation is set across the province provincially. This isn't something, District of Yarmouth isn't going out on a limb here by having planning versus other municipalities, for example. So with that, this project started, as I said, almost 2 years ago, and a lot of the early work was kind of behind the scenes on our end, getting to know the municipality. We toured the municipality, did a lot of background research on demographics and topography and geology and all that kind of stuff, to understand some of the key issues and to help inform future discussions. And so that resulted in a background discussion paper that's on the project website still. It's still available. And then we got out and launched the project to the public. And of course, this was the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had to be creative in how we did this, but we had a website, of course, advertising. And then we got into the initial engagement. And again, we had to be creative in terms of how we did this, sizing things to groups, sizes, requirements, that kind of thing. So we did engagement pop-ups, reached a lot of people that way, had an online survey, an interactive map where people could leave comments, and then stakeholder calls to, groups that would have specific information about key topics like the environment or housing or infrastructure, topic specific knowledge. And that initial engagement was really focused on, looking to the future. What is kind of your dreams for the future of the municipality? What would you like to see change? What would you like to see stay the same? And we heard a lot, but it kind of came through in some key topics that when you grouped it together, perhaps the biggest one's the environment. We heard a lot about people's desire for access to nature and trails, wanting to see the municipality's many lakes protected from overdevelopment or the impacts of development, and balancing, finding that balance between economic development and the environment. We heard a lot about housing. This is not surprising. We're hearing about this everywhere. Concerns about housing availability and affordability, and diversity, not just like households are changing. You have single family households, you have downsizing households. What people are looking for in housing is evolving. And particularly, we heard a concern about lack of rental options. We heard a lot about infrastructure. Roads are always high on people's minds, but also looking into things like alternative transportation, cycling, the future of EV charging, and where our transportation network's going. Also in infrastructure, we heard about renewable energy and servicing like sewer and water. And what underpins all of this is the economy. And again, that idea of how is that balanced with the environment. commercial opportunities, having the services and infrastructure needed to fuel the economy. And then kind of related to this, we heard a really, really strong pride in community and an eagerness, to share the district and of Yarmouth with the world and visitors, and like a real pride in the community that people live in. So we took all that initial engagement. We met with PAC. We kind of set some initial policy direction in how we wanted to respond to all of these topics and concerns and ideas that people raised. And we went back and we created draft documents, kind of first blush municipal planning strategy, land use bylaw, the idea of the policies and the regulations that would help achieve this future. And then we went out with those drafts for draft engagement, taking it back out to the community to see what did we get right, what did we get wrong, what could we improve. So this included an online presentation and then a recording of that presentation that was available for view afterwards. We had an in-person meeting, an online feedback form, and then as part of our obligation as municipality to kind of regional cooperation, reaching out to neighboring municipalities for their comments. And we had one response back from the town of Yarmouth on that item. And then we also sent it to the province for early review. So at the end of all this process, the municipal affairs will look at the draft documents, or the approved documents, I guess, at that stage, to see if they meet those minimum planning requirements, and also if they meet the provincial statements of interest for planning. So we like to send early drafts so that they can give an early review and we can make any changes now rather than having surprises later. So we did that as well as part of the draft engagement. We took all that feedback that we heard during the draft engagement, put it in a what we heard report, but also had policy directions, options for the planning advisory committee in terms of how we could change the documents to respond to the feedback we had. We had a workshop with the planning advisory committee to do that and got direction and came with an updated draft. So some of the key things that we heard about in the draft engagement were, a lot of them were environmentally related. So things like coastal development and water course buffers, standards for wind energy, standards for dark sky preservation, aquaculture, the sensitive environments, wetlands, protecting the Lake George watershed. But we also heard about housing and discussions related to policies on encouraging more housing. We heard comments about industrial zoning, the standards for it, and also the extent of the hard scratch road industrial zone. We heard concerns about enforcement. Rules are only as good as the drive to enforce them. Concerns about noise pollution, and then a lot of discussion on planning in general, like a concern in the community that do we even need planning? What is the standard of how what level of rules is appropriate for a community, and how that fits into our identity as a community. And then also discussion about the process for how we get to the municipalities follow in terms of engagement and drafts, and where people have input along the way. So we came back with the drafts, went back to PAC, got final direction, and now have final drafts in front of you as a council. Just quickly to take a step back here, I know people have different levels of understanding. Council, you're probably fairly familiar, but not everyone in the audience necessarily. So it's worth taking a step to say, how do we even do this? What's the system in Nova Scotia? Because that informs a lot of the decisions that we've made in the draft documents that you'll hear about today. So in Nova Scotia, we have a piece of legislation. It's called the Municipal Government Act, the MGA. It is our toolbox as municipalities. It sets out our rights and responsibilities and the tools that we have available to us. And there is a whole section on it on planning. Within that MGA, there are statements of provincial interest. There's 6, but 5 that apply outside Halifax. Drinking water, agricultural lands, infrastructure, housing, and floodplains, that all plans must be consistent with. And then, of course, those minimum planning requirements that I mentioned. Out of this toolbox, we make a blueprint for our community. It's the municipal planning strategy. It's the higher level document. It's got the vision, the goals, and the policies, and a lot of the context as well. It explains, to some degree, what council was thinking of when coming up with these policies, so that future councils and future staff can follow the logic and understand where we came from. And then out of this plan, we build our communities with the land use bylaw, which is the zoning and the regulations and the rules for development. And it's what Derek or Fuki would use to issue a permit for development. And the key thing is the bylaw has to agree with the plan, and the plan has to be consistent with the act. So in the plan, the act says that municipal planning strategy must contain statements of policy with respect to, for example, housing. The MPS, municipal planning strategy, might say something like the municipality of the District of Yarmouth values and wants to enable a diversity of housing options. And then you'd actually put that into practice through the land use bylaw by having zones that permit different types of housing and at a variety of scales. Some key things, because again, this goes back to the decisions we make and the tools we have. We as municipalities are bound by that toolbox. We only have the powers that the province gives us. So there are things in that act that explicitly we can regulate. Lot standards, building placement, building size, the uses permitted on the land. That's a huge one. It's called the land use bylaw. Things like signage, processes, storage, parking requirements, topsoil removal. But kind of equally important to this is there's this explicit list of things we can regulate, which means there's lots of things we can't regulate. And that list could go on forever. But there are a couple of key ones that come up that I hear a lot when I do engagement and stuff, that people, want to see us as municipalities regulate, and we just don't have the authority to do that. One of those is resource activities. So we don't regulate things like agricultural cropping or forestry, cutting trees. We can regulate the things related to them. So forestry is the easiest one to think of in my mind, is that, we don't regulate clear cutting, but we do regulate where we can regulate, where it's appropriate to have a sawmill, for example. We don't regulate lands below the ordinary high water mark, that's provincial and then federal territory. We don't regulate people. We regulate the buildings and the uses, but not who uses them. So we don't say this building can only be used by people named Ian and that one can only be used by people named Mark. We don't regulate motor vehicles, which kind of feeds into the discussion that we'll have about RVs, where it gets a little gray. And we don't regulate trees except in relation to development. So like prohibiting cutting of trees or that kind of thing can only happen in relation to development. And finally, the last thing I want to touch on before we dive into the details is kind of the processes. Because again, this comes into a lot of the decisions we make and a lot of the structures of how we put together our plans, because ultimately a lot of the decisions people make about development is how easy or hard it's going to be, and municipal planning processes come into that a lot. You can direct what people do or encourage people to do different things by having processes that are easier or harder. But also, as kind of the graphic at the top illustrates, there's also a spectrum of expense, risk, flexibility, and community involvement in different processes. So on one end of the scale, you have as of right development, we call it. That is where your development, you look at the zoning bylaw, the land use bylaw, you say, yep, my property is zoned residential. I want to build a house. It's permitted. I meet the setbacks. I meet all the standards. Great. I comply with the land use bylaw. It's straightforward. And you go to Derek and you say, I want a permit. And Derek checks the bylaw and says, yep, you're good. You get your permit. Great. All good. It's fast. It's straightforward. It's clear. It's also very rigid. So the next step up is site plan approval. And so in this case, there's additional criteria in the land use bylaw. They're very often qualitative, not necessarily hard numbers one way or another. And this gives some discretion to the development officer to negotiate with the developer to meet these standards. So it might be something more like, Screening is adequately placed to visually hide the development from surrounding residential uses or something like that. There's no numbers in that. It's more like looking at the specifics of this site. How does the site meet that standard? And then it's becomes part of a site plan that's forms part of the record of permitting. In this case, surrounding property owners are notified when a site plan approval is approved, and they can appeal the decision to council. So there's a little more risk, but a little more flexibility, but it takes a little more time. And then finally, you have development agreements. This is where you have to have policy in the municipal planning strategy that says you can have them for a specific use. And you actually basically write a contract. It's almost like a site-specific zone for that proposal and that property. It gets registered on title. It runs with the land, so future owners inherit it. And it's written specifically for that proposal. So it's really good for complex projects or projects with strong public interest where you need to have a lot of flexibility, but also potentially a lot of control. Of course, that all takes time, so it's slower. And there's surrounding property owners are notified, and approvals or denials, the property owner can appeal a denial. Approvals or denials are appealable to the UARB. And the development agreement process is a council process. It comes to you as a council to approve or deny based on the criteria of the municipal planning strategy. And finally, one other concept is that in the plan, we have designations. They are like high level, like to think of them of baskets or buckets of way we categorize land. All that yellow is residential, for example. It's broad. And it's kind of communicating the future potential for land. Then in the zoning bylaw, the land use bylaw is where you break that into further categories. So within that, yellow area, we also have the low density residential, we have the multi-unit residential, and then we have the general residential. And so that's where we get some of the like structuring the community through zoning. So as I mentioned, PAC in July passed a motion to recommend a draft of the municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw to you as a council and to schedule a public hearing. So at this point, that's their role in the process, and now it's on to you as a council to potentially move these documents forward. And there's the two documents that they recommended. So is it worth breaking now to ask any questions about process or like context, or should I go through it all and then we can come back?
I guess try to get some of the questions out of the way if there's any process questions or anything like that. Does anyone have any? I don't see any hands coming up, Ian, so I guess move on.
Okay. So as I say, I'll hit on high points. I added some extra detail for some topics that people flagged ahead of time as of being of particular interest. But certainly at the end of it, if there's topics you want more detail, we can dive into it. So from a broad structure in these documents, we've kind of split communities into three different types in the district. The first is service residential / commercial communities, and that's the Hebron and Lakes districts. That is areas where there's sewer and water in the ground that allows a higher density of development, can support properties that are closer together, and that more almost urban or semi-urban environment. Then we have the hamlets, which are communities that might have some services, might have sewer or water, and also act kind of as hubs for their surrounding community. They might have a higher density of services. They might have a gas station and a restaurant or whatever it may be. They kind of act as the hubs for the surrounding rural areas. And in your existing planning documents, you have Port Maitland and Arcadia. In this plan review, we've added South Ohio because there is the servicing there. And then we've also in your existing documents, Carleton's got its own zoning as the Village of Carleton, but under the MGA, Municipal Government Act, a village has a very specific meaning, and Carleton isn't an actual capital V village. So we've recategorized it as a hamlet in the draft documents. And then we have the rural areas, which is everything else. And, the idea of these documents is through the placement of the zoning and the policies is to reflect the unique aspects of each of those different types of communities. So one of the key topics, as I mentioned, that we heard a lot about was residential. And so these documents, I think, do a lot to loosen up the ability to do residential development, to provide opportunities for diverse residential development. And I know Derek's had a lot of interest from people already looking to take advantage of, the new rules when they come into effect for different things. So one of the big things is accessory dwellings. So this is, you might call it a granny flat or a secondary suite or carriage house. This is a second dwelling on a property, either within the main building, as kind of a basement apartment or whatever, or in a detached building in the rear or side yard. And this is permitted in the drafts in all zones that permit dwellings except the lakeside residential zone. There's a limit of 1 per lot. There's a limit on size. And there's a limit on total lot coverage. And the idea is that this is kind of a gentle way to provide housing options and to increase density without it being a huge change on the character of a community. Excuse me. The drafts also treat supportive housing. So this is your residential care facilities, your small options homes, your nursing homes. It treats them the same as a dwelling of a similar size. So in zones that permit multi-unit housing, that's where you would have your nursing homes, your residential care facilities, and in other residential zones you could have a small options home, just as you would a dwelling. A home is a home is a home. Another big change in the drafts is the creation of a new multiple unit residential zone. So previously, to do multi-unit developments required more complex processes, such as a development agreement. The new multiple unit residential zone would allow residential multi-unit developments up to 10 units as of right. So you could just come in and get a permit. And we've pre-applied that. We identified large areas of Dayton that are undeveloped and pre-applied that zone to make it easy and encourage people to build multi-unit there. And then in that zone, above those 10, there's policy to allow more by development agreement. And again, go through that more involved process to look at things like the impact on the neighborhood, servicing, all that kind of stuff. The other thing, a big change, is allowing up to 4 units as of right in all residential zones, except for the watershed zone. So, you could just come in and get a permit to do it. And finally, it's written as units per lot. So what this enables is they don't all have to be in one building. It can be grouped dwellings, we call them, where you might have, I think the most well-known example is the Treehouse Eco Village in Bridgewater, where it's, they each have their own little units. It's a condominium in that case, but they're not all in one building. They share some services, some amenities. You could do this as rental housing. You could do it as seniors housing. It's a different form of housing, but allows efficiency on a lot while keeping the scale small. And finally, there's policy support in the plan for what we call inclusionary zoning. So there was recent changes to the act that allows municipalities to require a certain percentage of of developments to be affordable through the zoning. You could say 20% of new units must be affordable or something like that. It's new policy, and there's a lot of questions around, or it's new policy, and there's a lot of questions around how do you actually administer that? Who's checking that it's affordable? How much affordability is appropriate that the market can supply it without actually preventing? You don't want to have a situation where it's impossible to provide and nobody just builds any housing because the affordability component's too high or something like that. So it's kind of a big question mark, and municipalities are sussing it out, but we think it requires more study before it's implemented. So we have policy support in the plan that says if the municipality, undertakes a project to look at this closer, that then that can be integrated into the bylaw. Oops, excuse me, pretty easily. So here is the zoning map for Hebron and Lakes districts, and you can see these big brown areas are that pre-zoning, that application in the multi-unit residential zone. On the topic of commercial development, the new documents are pretty similar to the existing ones. I'll go back up, there's commercial general zoning that's kind of carried forward. There's the rural commercial. It's all fairly carried forward. We're recognizing existing commercial uses. Though, because Carleton is now a hamlet instead of its own village zoning, we've applied hamlet commercial zones to existing commercial properties in Carleton. There is now in the plan policy support for commercial development districts. So this is a separate, it's not really directly related to planning. It's a thing under the Municipal Government Act for tax incentives in commercial areas, but you need to have policy support in the plan to do it. And so you as a municipality have some of those commercial development districts. We have that policy in there. And we've also included policy to potentially establish a new commercial development district in South Ohio if council ever wants to do that. One key topic that I know comes up a lot is accommodations and short-term rentals, Airbnbs, whatever you want to call them. So the approach that we've taken is that in commercial zones where you'd expect to find hotels, motels, whatever, accommodations are permitted, and that includes short-term rentals as a standalone use. Running it as a standalone business, that's all permitted in a commercial zone because it's a commercial use. In other zones, accommodations are permitted as a home occupation. So you can have your bed and breakfast, you can have your room rentals, you can have a bunkie on the property that you rent out as a short-term rental. But the key thing with home occupations is that it has to be happening on the primary residence of the operator. So what this is that I could rent out a bedroom in my home or my backyard on Airbnb, but I couldn't buy up a bunch of properties and rent them out in a residential zone. One other thing with commercial that we've done, and I wanted to flag this one because I know there's been some discussion about it, is small teaching. So this is the teaching with one student at a time, doing your piano lessons or whatever, reading lessons, whatever it is, guitar lessons. We wanted to make really clear that this isn't something that the municipality is not going to get involved in. We wanted to make it clear you don't need a permit, so we added it to the list of things that don't require permits. Everywhere you're just allowed to do it. There was questions raised about what about community activities like art night or whatever at the community hall, and generally that kind of thing I would expect that to be accessory to a community hall. Like that is something that is expected to occur in that kind of use. So if there's a permit for a community hall, that would be assumed to be permitted in that. Where you get into funny things is like if I wanted to open Ian's yoga studio and bring in a big class every day sort of thing, or a dance studio, that kind of thing, and it becomes very commercial in nature, there's, in that case, the drafts would expect you to get a permit, but there is an avenue for that through the home occupation provisions that you could have that you could get a permit for a home-based business, home occupation, for those small but bigger type teaching things. Councillor Durkee.
Thank you. This is a very quick question, and while I'm bringing it up because it's mentioned here, or you mentioned having bunkies as possible commercial property. My question is, can anybody have a bunkie and have people stay overnight without it being commercial?
Yeah, that always gets, then you get into code issues. I think your building inspector would officially tell you no, probably. And I use the word bunkie, but really, if it's being used for accommodations, it should meet code and have all the requirements of that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So there's the home occupations. So things like accommodations, building contractors, offices, small manufacturing. So that's for like if you wanted to do a wood shop or something, private teaching, studios. And then there's a maximum floor area, depending on your lot size. And then in rural areas and hamlets, there's an ability to do kind of more intensive home occupations like small engine repair by site plan approval, recognizing the rural nature of these communities and that those activities happen. Okay, industrial uses. So there's a couple of changes here. One is that what was called the rural industrial zone in the existing plan and bylaw has been changed to the general industrial zone because we're using it more broadly, not just in the rural areas. It's kind of the standard industrial zone. If someone wants to do industrial uses anywhere, they would come and ask for that zone from council. And kind of tied to that is that the former business and industrial park zone has been, or the business and industrial park zone rather, has been reduced in its range of uses. So this is the zone that applies to the Nova West Regional Business Park. Council's somewhat recently established kind of more direction for that park to rebrand it and focus on lighter industrial uses, business, heavy commercial, light industrial type uses. And so we narrowed that zone and kind of moved things over to the general industrial zone for other areas as kind of the default industrial zone. There is a new general industrial area along Hard Scratch Road from the town boundary to approximately where the dairy bar is. Recognize, providing a directed area for industrial expansion in the municipality. And there's also provision in that zone now for accessory residential. So basically to allow staff housing accessory to an industrial use. Okay, environment. There's lots on this one. So the first thing is coastal development, I suppose. And as you're likely aware, in Nova Scotia, we have a Coastal Protection Act that was passed a few years back and is not enacted yet through regulations. But the idea of that act is that there would be a province-wide approach to vertical elevation along the coast for development to account for sea level rise, and then also to a methodology for considering erosion and setbacks from the coast and distance from the coast. As I mentioned, that act has not yet been enacted, but it's presumably coming, though they've just announced another round of engagement before implementing that. But if it ever comes into effect, it's ideal from the perspective that all municipalities are basically treating it the same way. So where that's coming, the draft documents, rather than kind of try and tackle it and then have to come back later and remove whatever provisions are put in, they just defer to whatever comes in the future Coastal Protection Act regulations for coastal development control. That being said, there is a broad 12-meter watercourse buffer. So all watercourses in the municipality have a 12-meter setback around them. So that's a minimum distance, and that would apply to the coast as well. And then a major change in the proposed documents is a new lakeside residential zone. So this zone is applied to a distance of approximately 200 meters around most lakes in the municipality. And the concern we heard during engagement, I'm sure you've heard as councillors, is overdevelopment of lakes and the impact on water quality through nutrient runoff, clearing of buffers, that kind of thing. And often we're seeing blue-green algae as a result. So lakes are where people want to be, very understandably so, but we also want to make sure that development is appropriate to that environment. So the new lakeside residential zone, in that zone, the water course buffer is increased to 15 meters. And within that buffer, clearing is not permitted in relation to development. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about we can regulate it in relation to development. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools outside of that, but we do what we can. That being said, residential development in this zone is by site plan approval. So it's a little more involved, but the advantage of the site plan approval is that there is a site plan at the end of the day that shows the existing conditions on the site. And one of the challenges that the municipalities compliance officers have had is that in your current bylaw, there's provisions related to clearing along lakes, but it's really hard to enforce because there's not a very good record of where did vegetation exist. So someone clears their lot, someone complains about it, the development officer, the compliance officer goes in to say, oh, yeah, you did, but how do you prove how much they cleared, where it was, that all that kind of stuff. So the site plan approval will have a site plan that shows where that vegetation was at the time of permitting and provides a point of reference for any future enforcement actions. The site plan approval process, the criteria for in this zone also requires identification or avoidance of any known species at risk habitat, and that the proponent provide a stormwater management plan, and that's another incentive to maintain that riparian buffer because it's a huge control mechanism for stormwater that will go into the development. And there's also a larger minimum lot size to keep the density down in this zone, and it's more restrictive in the range of uses it permits, recognizing that a lot of development is going to be right next to water.
Ian,
Yes.
can you tell me exactly how big 5,000 meters squared is? How many acres is that?
That is about just over, that's about 55,000 square feet, I believe. And an acre is 43,000 square, so 1.25 acres, I think, if I'm doing my math in my head correctly.
Yeah, I believe you're right. Thank you. That's all I had.
More broadly on the topic of stormwater management, actually, is that all site plan approvals require a stormwater. Yeah, Victoria. Oh, I was pretty close. Victoria says 1.235527 acres. So I was off by 0.02. Not bad. Oops. Oops. Sorry. There we go. So yeah, the drafts require a storm management plan for all site plan approvals. So it's not for every type of development, but these kind of more involved developments that go through site plan approval. And then a major change in this draft is the sensitive environment zone. So in your current bylaw and plan, you have a coastal wetland zone that applies to salt marshes. And in initial drafts for this project, we updated that zone. We renamed it the sensitive environment zone to allow it to be a little more broadly applied, not just to coastal wetlands. And we updated it, Nova Scotia Natural Resources updated their forest inventory with more accurate aerial imagery. So what they do is they take these aerial photos and you can see on those photos where the boundaries of different land covers are, and they interpret that and create databases out of it. They've recently updated that to be more accurate and precise. So we used that new imagery to update some boundaries, and then Alex went through and, it's not perfect. No aerial interpretation is perfect. And he went through and found some areas where he knew those were inaccurate and improved it even further. So I'll skip ahead actually for a second here. You can see what we did this is on the left is the coastal wetland existing zoning, and you can see there was inaccuracies. There's that whole treat area that's very much clearly land. And then with the new forest inventory data combined with Alex's updates, you can see it's much more accurate. So there was a lot of changes there just in creating this zone. And we also expanded it to include beaches, dunes, and coastal rocks. When the drafts went out for engagement, there was a lot of discussion around the sensitive environment zone and a desire to see it expanded to cover more types of sensitive environments. And so PAC directed us to do that. So the sensitive environment zone now also includes general wetlands, open bogs, treed bogs, and wetlands and lakes. This zone limits development to parks and playgrounds, trails and conservation uses, and utilities. So it's a fairly restrictive zone, recognizing these are sensitive environments and potentially damaged by development, and also potentially hazardous to development. So here's an example of the current draft zoning map, and actually this also shows the lake zoning. The dark green's the lakes, so you can see the effect of that. But then this kind of teal green color is the sensitive environment zones all throughout the municipality. I think, yeah, I put one in. So the one on the left is the draft that would have gone out to the public in early 2023 with the sensitive environment zone in teal. And then, as you can see, it was all constrained primarily to salt marshes. And here's an example of the version coming out of Planning Advisory Committee with the expanded the expanded sensitive environment zone to the inland in the teal green. So there's quite a bit of expansion there. And we ran some numbers on it, and it covers doesn't cover them. It includes pieces of it, approximately 2,100 properties with a combined assessed value of just over $12 million. And we did raise some concerns with Planning Advisory Committee. I think, fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with such a zone. These are sensitive environments. The Act gives us the ability to protect them, and certainly, it's something to think about in planning for the future is protecting vulnerable environments. We do have some concerns just in terms of, timing. This is a fairly major change late in the game. There will be further engagement on the documents through the public hearing process, but a big push for the engagement was over the summer, and there wasn't an opportunity for people to see these maps and comment on them and raise specific concerns. We also have some slight concerns about boundaries. As you saw, it's gotten better, certainly with the modern data. But as I say, in aerial interpretation, there's always some errors or some, just because it's not possible you don't have that on the ground knowledge. And by and large, on a 1 to 10,000 scale, it's fine. But when you're citing a house, for example, and the matter of plus or minus a few feet might matter a lot. So there is a potential for situations where, in the future, that zone prevents someone from doing something they wanted to do, and they'll need to come to council they'll have to get a wetland delineator to identify the boundary and come to council to adjust that boundary to accurately reflect what's happening on the ground. That being said, I did review a lot of them, and at least on a high level review, even me looking at these maps and saying, yeah, those are very much wetlands, but there is that potential there for those little imprecisions to cause headaches for people down the road. But as of the recommended draft from PAC, the situation is the map here on the right, with all that teal color. Councillor Durkee.
Thank you so much, Ian. This is really helpful. Would most of those teal colored areas be forestry or open land as opposed to residential areas? Or will they affect some residential areas as well?
Yeah, thanks. So as I say, I did take took an hour or two one afternoon and kind of Google mapped aerial, looked at them all. By and large, they make sense in the sense that you look at them and you're like, yep, that's a wetland. A lot of them are around the lakes, which makes sense. That's, for example, this one, it's a extension of the lake where it's grown in and become marshy. There was one area that I kind of had concerns. There were some areas that I had concerns about that were like, it's close to residential and there might be more potential there for, where people have expectations of private development, where we're getting into questions of, people are going to look closer when the time comes, I think, where it's going to figure into people's decision making, if that makes sense.
Okay, so the likelihood is that if you were to build in those areas, or if you wanted to build, you'd have to infill in order to do that. Am I correct on that?
So yeah, in many of these, there, and this was the thing with the original sensitive environment zone where it applied to salt marshes. It was an easy thing to do because no one's building on those anyways. They're salt marshes. It's very clear. It's not a developable, even with infilling. It's a questionable environment to develop on. Many of these are wetlands that would need to be heavily modified before they could be developed, and there's a whole provincial process for that. And it's not always permitted, and if it is permitted, there's offsets that need to be made and that kind of thing. But I can't guarantee that they're all like that. That's the big thing, is that given the quality, or given it's a 1 to 10,000 data layer, it's an aerial interpretation, specifically at the edges of them. There may be instances where we have identified lands as sensitive environments that would otherwise be developable without infilling, for example.
Councillor Hilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just, Ian, I hear you say two different things. For the majority, these are recognized sensitive environment areas, and then I also hear you say that it could create conflict with progress within the municipality of Yarmouth. Where I think a majority of our residents are interested in protecting the environment. That was clear in the last MPS. It's clear in this one as well. For these areas, I think, and maybe a question for Victoria, is that at some point, I think we've asked how we could better address these areas. Is there any more work being done to on what and how we could recognize a certain number of these areas, making sure that they're correct on the map, but still leaving some of them on the map? Does that make sense? Like, because I feel like recognizing just salt marshes doesn't really do justice for the word sensitive environment area. We might as well just call it salt marshes. Like, I feel like when you read the new MPS, it recognized anything around the ocean but nothing inland.
So I can start, and maybe if I miss something, Ian can fill in. So I think staff's major concern was more around process and the lack of information to accurately answer your exact question, Councillor Hilton. I think work could be done. There are professionals in Nova Scotia who could take a look at the PIDs that have been identified on the proposed sensitive environment zones as recommended by the PAC, and do more wetland delineation. How much that would cost, I don't know. And we went from just over 600 parcels being impacted to over 2,000 parcels being impacted. And those additional landowners, they weren't consulted on the changes. So I think from a staff perspective, it's just around the technical nuances on managing an application. If there's a PID that in whole or in part is in the sensitive environment zone. And the cost for that landowner to go ahead and hire professionals, and then the process piece. But I do think, you know, that there are ways to answer your question, Councillor Hilton. We just haven't, we haven't been directed to do the work.
Just to follow up, Mr. Chair, to the CAO, I believe there was a motion made at some point to have, was it Upland and Caroline do that, some of that work, or bring back an answer to what that work might look like? Is that being done? I could be.
I'm not really recalling that. You know, the PAC sent their recommendation on to council, and the recommendation includes the map as presented today. So I'm not recall. I mean, that would be a significant project. We would have to hire consultants. We would have to develop a scope of work. It would be a significant body of work.
Okay, I'll forward that question to you. Thank you.
Sherry? Sorry,
So-
Councilor Gilbert.
Oh, that's okay. Because this is huge, and you know, our consultant has pointed out, you know, the concern about engagement and boundaries and all of those things. A process question to Ian or CAO Brooks: if we say, can we say yes to everything but this until the work gets done, or do we have to say yes to everything and figure? I guess my concern is that if we say yes to everything and like through the proper channels, and we leave this sensitive environment in here without feeling like we've done our due diligence, or do we take it, we meaning take it out and then figure out a way later? I don't, sorry, do you understand the question?
I do, yeah. So basically there are three options. You're quite right, Councillor Hobart. Council could approve first reading of the MPS and LUB with the original recommendation on sensitive environments, and follow that up with direction to staff to develop a project to analyze the proposed additional sensitive environments land and make sure that the PAC and council have accurate data on that. Council could approve first reading as is, as recommended by the PAC, and then do a project and look at the sensitive environment zones and maybe dial it back down the road. So there are those kind of three different ways of doing it.
Okay.
I wouldn't recommend you approve everything except the sensitive environment zones, because that leaves the whole notion of that layer of environmental stewardship with a big question mark, where, you know, we do know a certain amount of the land mass absolutely fits the criteria perfectly. So, you know, it might not be a good idea to approve the documents without any sensitive environment zones.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate that. That helps.
Councilor Durkee, then me.
Sorry, thank you, Warden. My question would be, if we agree to allocating these pieces as sensitive environment, can individuals still apply to the development office for a project that they would want in the sensitive area? Or are we saying there's no development at all allowed in it? And I think that would, if we did that, then that specific parcel of land could be analyzed as opposed to the whole thing.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in on that one. So as of right now, as it's currently drafted, where did I put that? Yeah. So within that zone, development as drafted is limited to parks and playgrounds, trails and conservation uses, and utilities. So if it's not one of those, the development officer can't issue a permit for it. And there's no current policy for anything by development agreement or anything like that. If a landowner engaged a wetland delineator and better identified the boundaries of a sensitive environment zone and found that theirs was wrong, they could potentially apply to council to rezone property and adjust the boundaries of that. And actually, I have some tweaks I need to make to the policy to make it clearer, but that, yeah, someone could update the boundary of that zone to accurately reflect the situation on the ground. But it's a process, it's a council process, it takes a couple of months. It's got to go to PAC, it's got to have a public hearing, you know, like any rezoning, and it's also appealable to the UARB. So there's time and risk and all of that that's put on the landowner as the applicant. If they do the wetland delineation and, you know, part of their land really still meets that criteria for the sensitive environment zone, the way the documents are set up right now, there is no ability on that area that is genuinely sensitive environment to do anything else, other than come and ask council to actually amend the plan itself and say, we're going to take a different approach. You know, you might write policy specific to that site, or you might change your approach to the sensitive environment zone. But it's kind of this tiered. It's like, either you're not in the zone, you can get approved. You are in the zone, but it's wrong, you're asking for a rezoning. If you are in the zone and it's right, you have to ask council to change the plan. They have no obligation to consider that. It's not appealable. It's kind of seen as a major change.
Thank you. That's really great clarification on it.
Okay, Ian, the next one would be me. The sensitive environment zone, from my understanding, and I've watched a few of the PAC meetings, even though I did not attend in person. At a May meeting, there was already a program initiated, I believe, on a special project to review the potential approaches to this sensitive environment zone. So there was a change between May, because PAC decided they were going to do that, and then in June, I believe there was a motion to include these in environmental sensitive zone, or the updated map. So does that mean that the project that was started in May, is that off now, or?
Yeah, and maybe the CAO can correct me. I understand that Carolyn had started scoping out, yeah, an answer to some of those questions.
It was around the Coastal Protection Act. It wasn't around the sensitive environment zones. So a couple of things had happened. Carolyn had been asked to provide draft responses around the Coastal Protection Act engagement, and she filed those with the PAC, who recommended them on to council. Then on the sensitive environments piece, there was an ask on the part of the PAC for staff to provide feedback on the proposed expansion of it. So the night that the expansion of the sensitive environment zones came up, the PAC had an interest in hearing back from staff. And so Upland filed a report with the PAC around that and did not recommend, based on the level of engagement and information available, to move ahead with the expansion of the zone at this time.
Okay, I'm actually a little less unclear on that now. So, because this is not the forum for me to debate or anything like that, it's just to gather information. So it boils down to the updated sensitive environment zone that was proposed in June is going to affect 2,100 property owners in the assessed value of over $12 million, correct?
Yes, that's what analyze that through the GIS, and that's what's come back.
And there was no public input.
Not as of yet. So the first time the public would have a formal opportunity to comment on these maps would be at the public hearing.
And for clarification, this would go to the CAO. Provided council passed this draft MPS LUB, that would mean that both would apply going forward, correct?
Yes, so it's my understanding in Nova Scotia that when you have an existing municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw, and council approves first reading of a new municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw, all applications must be viewed under the lens of both documents and comply with both documents in order to move forward.
Until the new one's adopted.
Right,
Until
yeah,
new ones adopted in whatever form it may come
Yep,
forward.
And
that's
then
right.
the old one gets discharged.
Because this is not the forum for me to debate and ask more specific questions, so I'm gonna leave it at that. I just wanted to be crystal clear on where we stood with this. Is there any more questions? All right, Ian, I
Yeah.
guess you can move forward some more if you have more.
I do. So there are a couple other topics on the environment. One was electrical vehicle charging. That's a new topic since the plan was last done. So we want to make sure it was clearly enabled. It's permitted as an accessory use, that's secondary to something else, i.e. non-commercial, basically everywhere. And then as a main use, as a commercial use, like an electrical vehicle charging gas station, for the lack of a better term, that's by zone, so basically permitting it in commercial zones. And then solar collectors are another thing that's now clearly recognized. They're permitted as an accessory use everywhere, and as a main use, so this would be like your utility scale solar farms, as a main use in the industrial zones, the airport zones, the rural zones, and the hamlet commercial zone. Wind turbines, micro scale, so that's like your little 1 kilowatt ones that might power an RV or something, permitted everywhere. Then small scale, which is less than 10 kilowatts, is defined in the bylaw, permitted in hamlets, rural zones, and industrial zones. And then larger scale, like greater than 10 kilowatts, this is where you start getting into feeding into the grid. These would be considered by development agreements, so it would be a council process in the rural development zone. Dark skies was another important topic we heard from people, both initially and then in the draft engagement. So there was some refinements that came out of PAC's discussions. So as where we landed, I guess, in the end was that lighting plans would be required for new commercial buildings, new industrial buildings, and new residential buildings with 5 or more units. So getting into that multi-unit territory. The drafts also require full cutoff lighting, so that's lighting that only is directed downwards, for on solar farms and for most uses that are considered via the site plan approval process. So and then in the plan there's a whole list of criteria that council's supposed to look at as part of making the decision on any development agreement. It's what you use to say yes or no, that that it meets the intent of the plan. And we've added a criteria in there for consideration of dark sky. So as a council, if there was a proposed development that was going to be detrimental to dark skies in the municipality, you would have the basis to turn it down on that.
Sherry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ian, was there any discussion on dark skies and residential under 5 dwellings? Only because I think that I've heard from some residents that they're concerned over homes that are being single use residential that are being built that seem to be interfering with their maybe not officially dark skies, but in their neighborhood, it seems brighter than it used to be.
Yeah, that through Mr. Chair, that discussion did come up at PAC of kind of where do we draw the line in the standards we set. PAC ultimately recommended against including it for small residential, low density residential, and the discussion at the time, even on all these, like I'll be honest, lighting's hard to enforce in the sense that people are getting development permits when they're building a new building, but no one gets a development permit. I don't think you'd issue a development permit to change out the light fixture on your porch, for example. So it's a little easier on commercial, industrial, and large residential properties, because any change to these buildings is typically major. It's probably done as part of a larger renovation or redevelopment that's going to require a permit, but not on, it's not the same level of scrutiny on a small residential project, for example. So it's really challenging. And yeah, so that's where PAC kind of got.
Perfect, thank you.
Ian, can I go back to the EV charging thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Accessory non-commercial everywhere. What type of EV charging are we talking about? Level 1, 2, or 3, or all of them?
So it could be any of them. But again, it's that non-commercial, and so the idea is that it's non-commercial. So you could, I guess, have level 3 accessory charging, and you might have that, for example, accessory to a bus depot or a industrial property where they're charging their trucks. But like the standalone commercial level 3, where Petrocan's setting up chargers along the highway, that would be, we'd consider that a main use, a commercial use. That would be in commercial zones. But everywhere else, that accessory use would typically be level 1 or level 2, I suspect.
Well, see, the thing of it is I happen to do know a lot about EV charging. I'm one of the very few people that's certified to work on EV vehicles, and the level 3 EV charging stations are very large and obtrusive. So I was just wondering if any consideration was at the time when this was brought forward, that if that was considered, especially as an accessory, non-commercial.
Yeah, it wasn't discussed so much with PAC that I can recall, but it is something that certainly would, it'd be up to the development officer to look at that idea of accessory. Like the whole idea of accessory is that it's secondary and subsidiary to whatever's happening on the property. So if I was putting a level 3 charger on my front lawn, it'd be a hard sell to call that accessory. Whereas if I'm putting a level 3 charger in my heavy equipment maintenance facility, or the municipal public works depot, for example, that's a lot easier to convince the development officer that that's an accessory use that way. The other place where it comes in is like, as gas stations start to go away and you see EV charging stations, like the whole idea of convenience stores, for example, they're accessory to gas stations. If you wanted to have a charger that had a convenience store, well, that's commercial, that's main use. That needs to be in a commercial zone. But yeah, you're right, there is a bit of gray there in terms of how does the development officer interpret what's accessory.
See, typically a level 3 station is a very large station, something that would take over 150 DC amps, and they usually have a big transformer, and they usually need to be close to 3-phase power. And I can understand that if you have a business that you've converted your fleet, like say if you had a courier service and you changed your fleet over to electric EV, and a level 3 charging station is what you would need to make it profitable, then yeah, I could see that. But if, not saying that it would happen everywhere, but this is just something that's in the back of my mind, because there was a couple articles that I've read out in Western Canada in regards to the size. They never realized the difference between a level 1, 2, and 3. Usually a level 1 or level 2 is just like a little high-end health thing that's no bigger than, say, your laptop at the most. But when you start talking about level 3, that's usually you need an accessory housing unit to cover up these units. So I just asked the question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, sorry for that. But
No worries.
that's the question that was on my mind.
Okay, the other topics I wanted to flag on environment. So in your existing plan, you have a dikeland zone that covers the dikelands, as the name suggests, and you have a floodplain zone that covers the Broad Brook floodplain. Both of these are continued. Not a whole lot of change there. And I guess something that's also worth noting is that they override the sensitive environment zone. So when we had a choice between floodplains or dikelands or sensitive environments, they went in dikelands or floodplains first. Servicing. So the plan documents also speak to sewer and water service. So, you know, municipalities, you as a municipality put a lot of resources. It's probably one of your biggest assets slash costs as a municipality is your sewer and water systems. So the drafts require connections to sewer where available. We want to make the best use of those services where they're available. And also now there's policy in there for future councils in considering any extensions, so that, you know, if someone comes forward looking for an extension, there's something for council to refer to in making a decision. And basically the idea being that, you know, that there's a clear benefit to the municipality beyond that one person kind of benefiting from the extension, that it's solving a health and environment risk or continuing a sustainable development pattern, you know, that's sort of a density to make use of those services, or that there's, for example, establishing a major employer. And that's option, you know, those are examples. It says, but not limited to, but basically council would be wanting to look at, is this for the betterment of the municipality? Transportation and parking. A key thing here is that in the service, residential, and commercial areas, only new public roads, development only on new public roads or existing any public roads or existing private roads. So basically saying no new private roads in the serviced areas. You know, these are areas where you have existing roads. Private roads come with challenges that are worth it in areas that are far flung and you don't want to be sending plows to them or maintaining them or owning them. But in serviced areas, it's easier to do this as a municipality, and you know, the benefits of public roads make more sense here. We took a look at your minimum parking requirements and kind of dialed them down a little bit, putting them on the lower side. It's important, particularly in areas that aren't super urban, to have parking requirements to reduce overflow onto neighboring streets and that kind of thing, but you don't want to require too much. There's a cost to that. It makes things very far away from each other. So we took a close look and dialed them down a little bit. We don't in the drafts require bicycle parking, but there is an ability for people to reduce the amount of automobile parking they have to provide if they provide some bicycle parking in lieu as a kind of incentive to, you know, we're seeing a lot more bike tourism and also bike day-to-day, meeting your day-to-day needs by bike since the pandemic. And then there's also policy support. So, you know, the land use bylaw is one of the main tools for implementing the planning strategy, but the other one, another major tool is the subdivision bylaw, which controls the subdivision of land and the construction of infrastructure. That's not being updated as part of this project, and the municipality has recently gone through an updated subdivision bylaw. So we put policy support in for future amendments to require sidewalks and active transportation connections. So this wouldn't go into effect now, but next time you update the subdivision bylaw, there's policy support for that kind of thing. Rural and resource. So in the municipal planning strategy, we identify agricultural soils. That's a requirement of the statement of provincial interest on agricultural lands. That statement also requires you to protect agricultural soils in relation to their importance provincially and in the area. You know, District of Yarmouth is not Kings County. It's not the breadbasket of Nova Scotia. There's not a need, I don't think, from a planning perspective for heavy-handed controls on agricultural soils like there is in a place like Kings County. So there aren't specific, there's no specific agricultural zone or anything. It's in relation to the importance provincially, but those soils are identified as in the plan as required. Resource-based uses are broadly permitted in hamlet and rural zones. That's kind of key to the existence of these communities and the culture and the economy of these communities. I'll skip that because I have it later. There's an exemption now for small scale farm, fish, and forestry stalls, making it clear that you can sell the veggies at the end of your property. You don't need a permit. No one's going to get in trouble for that. And recognizing the importance of the fishery, there's a broad exemption for outdoor storage of fishing gear and equipment. Like you're exempt from any restrictions on outdoor storage for those things, because again, that's really important to the community. Heritage and culture. Through these documents, we've created incentives to registering a heritage property is kind of a public good in many ways, but it comes with a burden in terms of limits on what you can do for renovations and all that kind of stuff. So we like to create a couple small carrots to do these things. So registered heritage properties in these drafts aren't required to provide parking. They can have some extra things like a extra accommodations unit or an extra boarding house unit. And one of the key things is there's policy in the plan that enables unique uses in heritage properties by development agreements. So if you had a registered heritage property and you wanted to do something in it that was really different than what the zoning allowed, you could come to council and ask for that and show that it's consistent with the community and that it's going to help, encourage reinvestment in that heritage property. So there's a really cool one in Halifax here that used a similar policy where they reinvigorated this heritage property, put a kind of traditional English style pub in it, and it's under a similar policy, and it's been really successful. Cultural uses, community uses like community halls and stuff are widely permitted. Similar to the heritage property policy, there's an adaptive reuse of institutional buildings by development agreement. So, we're seeing a lot of churches close in Nova Scotia. A lot of old school buildings often come up, particularly now with the housing crisis and the provincial government reviewing its assets and putting things up for surplus. These old institutional buildings that are looking for a new life, there's a policy there to allow people, again, to do kind of unique things that wouldn't otherwise be permitted by in such properties by development agreement. So again, coming to council and the community and showing that it fits.
I'm sorry, Ian. I did see Nick's hand up, but I don't see it up anymore. Nick, you still there?
Yeah, it was in regards to the storage for fishing gear, and I wondered if that applied for shipping containers. There's a whole new section in this document for shipping containers, is there not? And I had questions yesterday in relation to that and how that would be affected. Like, can you?
Yep, I'll talk about it now. I have a slide later, but I'll talk about it now because we're on the topic. So the way the drafts address shipping containers is if you meet building code, you can use it as part of a building. We're seeing that sometimes, people shipping container architecture. As a storage building, the drafts enable it up to 40 feet in total. So you could have two 20-footers or one 40-footer or whatever in hamlets and rural zones, and then unlimited in industrial zones because they're actually used industrially.
Just a follow-up question to that, specific to the airport noise restriction zone. Is that zone, are you able to rezone land in that to make it industrial?
Ooh, off the top of my head, I don't believe so. That zone is aligns with noise forecast contours that the federal government puts out. I'd have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure there's a pretty hard policy on not rezoning that zone.
I'm going to send you a question in relation to that because there's a lot of commercial use in that zone, and the way we've written the shipping container bylaws, you can only have the 40-foot in that zone.
Right.
Yet the airport stretch is highly commercial with lots of businesses that might benefit from multiple ones. There's one there now. So how do these changes affect, kind of grandfathering and people that might have one or two on there? Do they now have to remove what they already have?
So, and this is a broad statement to anything in these documents, is if something legally existed prior to this, so either existed from before there was planning at all or was legally permitted under a previous bylaw and got the permits, any changes that would no longer permit that, those things gain the protection under the Municipal Government Act of non-conforming. So they're permitted to continue. They're quote unquote grandfathered. But for example, if it's a building, it's not permitted to expand in a way that would make that non-conforming worse. Like if your house was too close to the property line by modern standards, it would be a non-conforming structure. We're not making you tear it down, but you can't build more onto the front and make it worse. You could build on the back. Same with uses. Like if you had a auto garage in a neighborhood that's now zoned residentially, we're not coming and shutting down the auto garage. You're allowed to continue, but you can't, if you discontinue that building for a long time, or that use for a long time, then you're expected to conform, for example. So yeah, if they were legally existing, they'd be protected, but where it does get fuzzy sometimes in terms of proving what was there, and if it's a shipping container or something that's movable, it might get a little murky. So it's a good consideration.
All right, I'll send you a follow-up email. Thanks.
Councillor Durkee.
Thank you, Warden, through you to Ian. So you're allowed to have two 20-foot containers, but are they considered accessory buildings? Because you're technically only allowed to have one accessory building.
That's a good point. Have to look at that again. Yeah.
Just remember, everyone, that this is not a place to change. It's just to bring it up, things that you see and may want to bring up during the regular council meeting on the 27th.
Yeah. Thank you. Just wanted to know if they were considered accessory buildings. Thank you.
Yeah, keep that question in mind. I've gotten a bunch that I have written down here. All right, is there anyone want to, since we stopped Ian, anyone have any more questions? I did see Derek had his hand up. Derek Robertson, or was that just to add to Councillor Nick Hilton's question?
Yeah, I was just going to add to the airport noise restriction zone. You can't rezone to industrial, but it does allow some industrial uses currently, is the way it works. So I don't think it would really affect the shipping container thing.
Yeah, and it seemed to me back quite a few years ago, we allowed a pet cemetery. We called it industrial use. We rezoned right at the end of the longer runway. And down towards the what road was it? The Wyman Road, I believe. Councillor Hilton?
Just to follow up to Eric's comment, I believe it does, just the way it's written, because the airport industrial zone is in one of, it's like B that says you can have the 40 up to 40 feet, but not in the one that has unlimited. So I was just wondering, maybe that was worth moving to the other zone. And not because it benefits one person, but because it's in an area that we're probably promoting commercial use at.
All right, see no more questions. Ian, turn it back over to you. Continue on, please.
All right, Parks and Rec. As we heard, access to nature and trails was really important to people. So we permit parks and playgrounds in most zones, excepting industrial zones, and trails permitted in all zones. So they don't necessarily need to be specifically zoned for recreation to have those things on them. But there is a standalone recreation zone that council can use to specifically identify, important recreational assets or whatever that it wants to communicate, but that doesn't stop the development officer from granting a permit for a park or playground in other zones. There's also policy support. So one of the things municipalities can do through the subdivision process is require parkland dedication, that when a subdivision occurs, land or cash in lieu of the land is given to the municipality for public purposes, recreation parkland purposes. So we have policy support in the draft municipal planning strategy for that tool. RVs. Okay, so this was one of the topics that was flagged as looking for more discussion. So I've put some detail here. So RVs, as I alluded to earlier, get a little gray because they border that, they straddle that boundary between being vehicles and being a land use. They are vehicles, they get permits, stickers, they move around, but then people set them up some permanently or semi-permanently. Very often people want to get a permanent power connection to them, maybe even hook them into septic. So they exist in this funny realm. From a municipal perspective, they don't end up getting taxed. They're not assessed. So it's something that all the municipalities I work with are struggling with them. How to treat them. The other thing with RVs, sometimes you get the kind of what becomes almost a private campground in the sense where, when I worked in Kings County, we had one where friends bought some property all together. They had multiple RVs on it as their cottage. Is a very fair thing to do. But it also ended up being a density of development that really impacted the environment and the people around them and became quite a point of concern. So we tried to thread the needle here a little bit on having some level of controls that allow the municipality to deal with really egregious cases with RVs, while also allowing them to happen in all the various ways people use them to meet their recreational and now also housing needs. So all that to say, where the drafts fell in the end was that we've defined more than two RVs on a lot as an RV park. So if you're getting those big groupings of RVs together, you fall into the definition of RV park as a use. And then you need to be in an appropriate zone that allows that, and you need to go through the permitting process. And that's possible by site plan approval in the Hamlet commercial, rural development, rural commercial, lakeside residential, and recreation zone. So it's possible. It's an extra level of, kind of approval that's needed. And certainly there's a burden to that, but it's also, as you're getting up to that 3+ RVs, the impact is higher and particularly in the environment and neighbors and wanting to have some oversight of that as a municipality. There's also the question of kind of the individual RVs. By and large, the document is silent on them. We don't have time limits on them or anything like that. I've tried it in other municipalities. It's really hard to monitor and enforce. And more and more we're seeing situations where it is the only option for some people. And municipalities are not sometimes particularly keen to enforce because people are using them for housing. So where it falls is that there is a provision in there that no automobile, truck, bus, or coach body, whether or not same as mounted on wheels or beach vessel, shall be used for human habitation within the municipality, except for recreational vehicles and travel trailers. So this provision allows RVs to be used as habitation. But importantly, recreational vehicle, means vehicle, blah, 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 but does not include any vehicle that meets the definition of a derelict vehicle under the Municipal Government Act. So basically, you can use it for habitation if you keep it from becoming derelict under the Municipal Government Act. And what that does is allows, if the municipality is faced with a really extreme situation and there is a desire to enforce, someone is permanently encamped, it's no longer registered, it's causing problems, there is an ability there to say it's no longer an RV because it's a derelict vehicle under the MGA, and enforce on that. The one other aspect is that very often with these, people want to get a power hookup or whatever, and there is a pathway through that, in that the drafts allow personal storage buildings to be built without a dwelling. So Nova Scotia Power often will hook those up to power. You build a storage building, they'll run power to that, and then you can plug in as an RV to that.
Councillor Durkee, then Councillor Sherry Hurlbert. Councillor Durkee, I think, just went away.
I'm still here. No, sorry, I did not unmute. What if someone takes a bus and turns it into an RV?
So yeah, my understanding of that, as long as it was registered as an RV, like you would have to get registered appropriately with the province as a recreational vehicle, and then you meet that definition. You wouldn't be derelict. You'd be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hurlbert?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our current rules, to my understanding, there is a limit on how long someone can reside in a recreational vehicle, correct?
I will turn to Derek for that.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So recreational vehicle in our current rules, is there a limit on how long someone can live, reside in that before they?
Yeah, it's 60 days consecutively. So, if they leave and come back, it resets.
So under our new, sorry, excuse me, under our new rules, that would not be the case?
Correct. It's just the limit on how many would be on one property, I
Okay,
believe.
thank you.
Any more questions? Question I had, Councillor Hurlbert had already asked. I guess I could expand on that a little bit, Ian. So item 6. What happened here? 6.29.1, no automobile, truck, bus, or body coach, whether it's not the same as mounted on wheels, beach vehicles shall be used for human habitation within the municipality, except for recreational vehicles and travel trailers. So are recreational and travel trailers, are they defined in our MPS and LUB or in the new one? I didn't have a chance to flip
Yeah,
back.
definition.
I get the paper version of the old one. I don't have the paper of the new.
The definition for RVs there at that last bullet there.
So that is the definition of it. Okay. All right, thank you. Any more questions, comments? Hearing none. Keep continuing, Derek.
You're in the end here. So another topic that was flagged for discussion is livestock. So traditionally what you'd see in Nova Scotia planning documents is a kind of table that's, with animal units, that 1,000 chickens is one animal unit, or 10 cows or whatever, and it was all based on kind of manure load and all that kind of thing. And then regulations would be based on, you'd have rules about how many animal units are permitted in different areas. That gets really challenging from a permitting and enforcement point of view. Like, is Derek going out and counting, oh, you've got 10 cows, oh, well, you just had one just got born, now you're not permitted anymore. It gets really challenging. So we've moved to a model where regulation of livestock is based on the size of the structure to contain them, or for them to live in. So we have two categories, or I guess three. Is like really small, lower than 7 square meters would just be an accessory building. So that's, you got your chicken hutch or whatever. Our second category is the household livestock. So this is permitted. This is where you have basically a small barn for livestock enclosure. So larger than 7 square meters in gross area, up to 340. That's what, like 3,600 square feet or something like that. That is permitted in all areas except for the lakeside zones on larger lots, 4,000 square meters. So that's just over that's about an acre. Then intensive livestock, that's basically your commercial scale. That can be considered by development agreement in the rural development zone and airport noise restriction zone. And that includes, so that's your dairies, your chicken barns, your fur farms, that would be considered in those zones by development agreement. So we're not regulating individual chickens or anything like that. And then I guess the other question that came up was that, enclosures. So we don't specify fencing or anything in this bylaw, but Nova Scotia does have what's the Livestock Enclosures Act, I think, and detention of stray livestock or something like that, that speaks to there's already provincial legislation limiting animals running at large. Fun fact, as a municipality, you are required to have an animal jail under that act. That's unlike a committee that deals with it and everything like that. But so yeah, that already exists.
Okay, Ian, in that regards, in regards to livestock, is it defined in our new current municipal planning strategy, or sorry, in the draft one, is it defined as what open range and free range is?
No.
Animals?
No.
Any other questions? All right. Councillor Hilton just put up his hand.
Yeah, sorry. What is the definition of livestock? Like, who decides what that definition is?
Good question. Let me just see if we actually have one in there. A second here. Yeah, it does get. I had a friend who worked at HRM and had to. He got called down to the front desk because there was an argument over whether someone's teacup pig was a livestock. No, it's not currently defined in the draft.
Maybe that's something we should consider at the next meeting.
Yeah, that's a good one to flag. Let me note that.
Any more? Hearing none.
Aquaculture. So obviously this was a hot topic as a standalone project while we were going through the plan review process. So where we landed on in the draft was kind of carrying forward the direction from that. Is that the municipality can consider land-based aquaculture systems by development agreement in industrial zones, and that they must be recirculating systems. And in the policies for that development agreement, so in the thing, like in the plan, there's a whole bunch of policies that relate to how council goes about considering those development agreements. There are requirements on the applicant that we've put in that they have to provide a stormwater management plan, a site plan, and a big one is that they have to provide detailed information on the particulars of the system. I know this was a concern in past development agreements, in like not everyone knew the full set of information. It was challenging to even comment on an application. So there's a policy requirement for a detailed application with details of the system. And in that definition of recirculating, there's a requirement that no discharge to the marine environment, so that the waste effluent needs to be dealt with other than just discharging it into the environment.
Deputy Warden Trevor Cunningham, who has joined us. I didn't see when he came on, but obviously he's there here now. Trevor, you have the floor.
Right. So my question is to Ian, is that there was some ability to not have 100% recirculation in the initial draft that came to PAC, and it was changed via vote. Can you comment on why you would have had some some ability to discharge like you would any other industrial setting, for instance, a lobster holding facility or what have you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, that was brought up as a concern with the initial draft around some clarity around what does recirculating mean, how much, and making sure that the line is clear. So where we landed on with the PAC recommended draft was having the prohibition on discharging to the marine environment. So a lot of the, at the end of the day, there's waste from any operation, whether it's aquaculture or anything else, and a completely contained system is just simply not possible. A lot of what the kind of cutting edge facilities are doing, for example, is having engineered wetlands that can treat effluent, or you can do things like dewater it and truck it off site, for example. So there's other ways of dealing with it. But one of the biggest concerns we heard around aquaculture was the potential impact on the marine environment. So that was a key aspect of where that definition of recirculating landed.
Okay, Trevor, you good? See his thumbs up. Councillor Lauren Cushing is also with us. Lauren, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. On this, land means a land-based facility with the commercial cultivation of fish, shellfish, or aquatic plants or algae, in which utilize closed containment system to prevent the discharge of waste products to a marine environment. What's your definition of waste product?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I don't think there's a specific one in the plan, and where this is a development agreement process, ultimately it would be up to council to refine or to evaluate based on this policy. So it'd be council's interpretation. I would certainly think about effluent in terms of the any waters that come out of the system that might carry animal waste or food waste or pharmaceutical waste for whatever it is they're farming. Basically that you're not releasing it into the ocean.
So there's no real definition that we have so far for waste
No,
product.
not specifically.
Okay, so that's something that we can discuss. Right? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions or comments? People may notice that I seem to be distracted, but I got a whole bunch of papers and I got 2 MPS LUBs in front of me. So I am trying to do my best to keep up with everyone's questions. I don't see any more, Ian, so I guess you can move on.
Okay. We touched on shipping containers already. Let me see here. So as I mentioned early on in this, we have designations and zones, and generally, the zone, for example, in residential designations, you're allowed to have residential zones, for example, and not commercial zones. There is a policy in there that allows zoning to zones permitted in adjacent designations. So like if it's a property right on the edge of a commercial district that's currently residential, council could consider rezoning, recognizing a minor expansion of that commercial area, for example. There's an expansion of variances. So the Municipal Government Act enables the development officer to vary certain aspects of the bylaw requirements in areas where there's site-specific hardships. So for example, if you had a really awkwardly shaped property, the development officer might be able to vary the minimum setback from your lot lines, recognizing that like it's not reasonable to force you to meet those requirements on your unique property. You can expand that list if it's provided for in the plan. So we've done that. So it's not just things like building height and lot setbacks. We've also enabled the development officer to vary things like parking requirements, for example, if there's a reason that specific site can't accommodate them. We've included a policy in the plan that allows council to consider rezoning instead of having a rezoning to undergo a development agreement. And where this is used is, for example, whenever you rezone a property, you don't actually control what happens with it in the end. So I might come forward and say, I want to rezone this property to open my woodworking shop. I want to rezone it to industrial to open my woodworking shop, which is all fine and good. Maybe the community is fine with a woodworking shop, but that zone allows asphalt plants. And the community is concerned that me in the future, or if I sell it, someone might open an asphalt plant on the newly zoned property. So there might be opposition on the basis of like what could happen. In this case, the policy allows council to say, yeah, we could give you that rezoning, but we're worried that it's gonna, there's gonna be a lot of opposition about what could happen. We'll instead write a development agreement that ties you to what your proposal is, so that everybody's, there's not as much concern there.
Councillor Hilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you to Ian, like who decides what a development agreement looks like? Council does? And is there ever like it always talks about shall and not, may, when it talks about development agreements, you shall do this instead of you may do this. Is there ever such thing as like a standard development agreement that would be included in this type of document, a starting point that you have to consider these 10 things with every development agreement, and then others like, when it like, I'm kind of thinking about noise, odor, there must be a standardized development agreement. I just feel like everything talks about you shall do this and none of it is you have to do this. So it's only as good as and no offense to the table, is the people sitting around the table at the time. I'm one of them and I don't know what I don't know. So is there a standardized process that the development office would follow or could follow?
Through you, Mr. Chair, generally, yes and no. Not like there is no in Nova Scotia standard development agreement. What usually happens is that municipalities kind of build up their own standard development agreement over the years, according to their practices over time. And part of the reason there isn't a standard is because the whole idea with development agreements is that they're meant to be used to consider unique or complex proposals that don't neatly fit in the box. Because if they neatly fit in the box, then just write it in the zoning. The development agreement allows council to look at the particulars of that proposal and say what works, what doesn't work for this context, and let's craft rules around it to meet that context. There are a couple things that the Act says a development agreement must have, and that's it must specify the types of development that are permitted and the conditions on that development, and set the terms that council can amend or discharge the agreement. Those are you must have those. And then sometimes in the policies in the plan, we'll write, specific things that have to happen for that type of use. So for the example being aquaculture, in that development agreement policy, we say you have to have all this information for council to even consider you. Other ones that are more straightforward, like residential, we say, yep, you can consider it by development agreement, subject to the broad list of things that council can think about at the end of the document. And so there's a list at the end, and council can look at it and say, Ian's wanting to build a multi-unit building next to this lower density residential neighborhood. The concerns in the neighborhood are about traffic. Well, the requirement we're going to put on them is that the traffic exits to the main road rather than to the side road, because that's what's important in that context, And so there's a list of things that council can include or can consider and should think about as part of every proposal, but doesn't need to because they don't necessarily apply to every proposal that would be considered by development agreement. But all that's long to say is, you know, you'll be relying, you know, that's why you have a planner as a municipality to at least take a first blush attempt at what the development agreement should contain and put it all in the technical writing that it needs to be. But then you as a council hear from the community, hear from your own knowledge of the community, and adjust that development agreement as necessary before you adopt it.
So just to follow up to that, like, and I'm starting to understand what you're saying, but don't fully. When, like, I think of like the parkland dedication, when we do that, you know, we run it by recreation and a couple other things. That's part of the process. Not a very in-depth process, but you know, our area, you know, we live in a rural area that appreciates you know, the environment around us, being able to live in a quiet community. And I was just wondering, like, is there the ability to put in a document like this, you know, just, you know, what could be considered in a development agreement, not in depth, but just to make sure that, you know, every development agreement considers a certain number of things, you know, if it's traffic, if it's noise, if it's odor, not
Yeah.
in depth, just so that it's there as a check the, not necessarily check the box, but to make sure that council at the time is checking the box. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that's exactly. Yeah, so there's a policy 621 in the draft, 6-21. That's the broad policy for council. It's the kind of the checklist for evaluating any development agreement or any bylaw amendment. Is that council shall not amend the land use bylaw or enter into a development agreement unless council is satisfied the proposal is not premature or inappropriate due to, there's a whole list of things, and they're not all going to apply to every application. You know, one of the criteria is the for example, the adequacy and proximity of schools, recreation facilities, and other community facilities. Well, if you're doing a development agreement for industrial use, that doesn't matter. You know, whatever, you can just say not applicable. But if you're doing a development agreement for a 200 unit residential development, you might want to say, oh, do we have the school capacity to accommodate this, and have that as something that you look at as part of evaluating that development agreement. And then there's a list in policy 6-17 of all the different things that council could put in a development agreement to make sure that you're meeting that checklist, basically, that, you know, that concerns about schools or about servicing or about traffic or about potential for environmental impacts are managed. Or if you think you can't manage them, if the proposal can't be
If
managed.
you're anything like me, you probably hate needles and finger sticks. Keep tabs on your blood sugar levels anytime and anywhere with the Vital Watch. No need to prick your
Yeah, if those impacts can't be managed, then that's a reason for council to turn it down and defend itself if you get appealed to the UARB.
Just one last question, Mr. Chair. Like, but you say the word shall, does that mean that it can be considered or it has to be considered? Like, can we use words like, wow, any stronger language needed, or is that a common practice?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, it's fairly common, like, so it's shall not amend unless council is satisfied. So it puts the ball in your court in terms of, like, you know, you should look at these things. You need to satisfy yourself as a council that this is not premature or inappropriate due to traffic, capacity of schools or whatever. But it's on you, like, you know, as a council, you can look at it and say, yeah, we're satisfied this isn't going to cause a problem with schools because it's an industrial project and it's not going to create any school children. So it does, yeah, it puts the ball in your court as a council.
Okay, any more? None? I don't know where you were stopped, Ian, in regards to this.
Oh yeah, so the last three bullets. Yeah. So there's a policy now there for neighboring municipalities engagement. That's a requirement of the minimum planning requirement regulations standards. And where PAC landed on that was, I think it was within 500 meters of the border of the town, I believe, would be reaching out to them for engagement, or if there's a whole new plan. There's also policies for notification distances. So when there's development agreement applications or rezonings or that kind of thing, the notification happens to neighbors. We've updated these a little bit. So in rural designations, everybody within 500 meters of the subject site would get notified. It would be 300 meters elsewhere, unless it's on a lake. All the properties, in addition to those distances, all the properties on the lake would get notified specifically with a letter. That's in addition to, like, there's broad public notification through like newspaper ads and stuff, but these are letters that go out to the property owners.
Okay.
And then finally,
can I stop you there? This is a little bit different than it used to be in the other one. Was this change due to the public consultation piece that you had?
So this was in response. This came up a couple times in public consultation and also in discussion with the former development officer. Because in your previous or in your existing plan bylaw, notification is done on the basis of, was it up to 50, the first 50 properties or something like that from a site? Like, it's based on a number of properties and you go out until you reach that number. And it causes challenges to some degree in urban areas that you can hit that number really quick and not actually notify very far around the site, even though people are impacted. And it also was causing challenges in rural areas where you might have to go really far before you hit that number. You know, like you could be kilometers away before you met that quota of properties that you had to notify, and people were getting letters for developments that were kilometers away and going, why am I being notified for this? So this kind of ties it more to the potential geographic area of impact, I suppose. And you know, it's never perfect, but it
No, it
avoids
never is perfect. I just asked if it
Yeah.
come through public consultation or anything. So if it did, it did. Okay.
Okay, my final bullet point there is that, so as I mentioned, there's statements of provincial interest on agricultural lands, housing, drinking water, floodplains, and infrastructure. And there's been a big push from the province to address those better. So the municipal planning strategy now has a section at the front that speaks specifically to those statements of provincial interest and shows that we meet them, or how we meet them. So it should avoid, hopefully, any surprises when it goes for ministerial review. So that's my high level overview. And that's the high level overview. That's not all the details, but just in terms of next steps. So we have had a recommendation from PAC. Council is in a position to give this document first reading and schedule a public hearing. At that point, the documents, there's notification that goes out in the newspaper. There's legislative requirements for that. Council would then hold a public hearing, and that is where members of the public are invited. They can provide written comment ahead of time or stand up and say their piece directly to council. It's not a discussion and debate. It's very much it's a hearing. You know, people stand there, they speak, council hears. Council doesn't discuss. Once that hearing is closed, council can either give the documents second reading, which means they're adopted, the documents are adopted, and they go off to the minister for review. Or if council hears from the public, you know, strong concerns, and council wants to make changes to address those, if they are substantive changes, so those are changes that like affect people's rights, basically, at the end of the day, they're not just clarification or something like that. Council then needs to make those edits and hold first reading and another public hearing again to give people the ability to comment on those substantive changes. A couple of key things here is that only councillors present at the public hearing are allowed to vote at second reading. And also, generally, it's considered bad practice and opens you up to legal challenges to hear new information after the public hearing. So ideally, second readings held as soon as possible after, and if there is a gap, councillors should be careful about not getting in discussions with people or that kind of thing. And then finally, as was kind of touched on earlier, once council has notified of their intent to hold a public hearing, once that ad is placed, development permits must meet both the existing land use bylaw and the one that is proposed. So you have this period where there's a dual approvals, which can cause problems for people trying to get, it's more, there's an extra level of administration that's required there. And B, sometimes, there's developments that are permitted under one, but not the other. And because of that, aren't permitted at all. So ideally, and, it's very important, the public hearing is a meaningful thing. I don't mean to suggest it's not. And if there's time needed to respond there, it should be done. But ideally, the time between first reading, public hearing, and second reading is kept as short as possible, just to avoid drawing out that dual approvals stage. And then one other thing I will say, so as I mentioned, this is a discussion day, not a time to make direction. Council can do that at their next meeting. If they are not wild changes, not hugely substantial changes that require a whole rewrite, we could potentially also give first reading at the same meeting. We don't have to. But if there are things ahead of time that you think you might want to discuss, it might be worth flagging them to me, and then we can be prepared to discuss those at that first reading meeting. I would suggest is probably a good way of going about it. So
I
that was a lot.
One more question in regards to the next steps. Is the first reading, the public hearing, the second reading, then it goes for ministerial review. After the second reading, council potentially passes it. Isn't there a utility and review board aspect that the public would have up to 14 days to appeal council's decision?
No, not with a plan review. So when you're adopting a plan, it just goes to the minister, and they compare it against the statements of provincial interest and the minimum planning regulations. The utility and review board appeal only applies to approvals done under plan policy. So if you have a municipal planning strategy and you're doing, for example, a development agreement or land use bylaw amendment, those are appealable to the UARB, but any changes to the plan itself are not appealable.
Any questions from anyone? Quite much. Okay, so if this is, so you're done with your debrief on this, I'm assuming, Ian. So is there any discussion and questions that any council member has? Just remember, we will not be discussing this at Thursday's committee of the whole meeting. This is one agenda item only for our regular council meeting on the 27th, and I'm assuming, Ian, you're going to be there in person.
Yes, I will be.
Yeah. So if there's no more questions or comments, is everyone's questions answered? I'm probably like me, sometimes you write down a whole bunch of notes and you have a bunch of questions afterwards, but I have nothing else, so I'd entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. Moved by Deputy Warden Trevor Cunningham, seconded by Councillor Nick Hilton to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Motion carried unanimously. Thank you very much, Ian, for that document. I went through this process